Hello everyone, Mario Kart World has introduced so many changes to the Mario Kart formula that I think some have kind of gotten lost in the shuffle. Case in point, the game's dynamic day-night cycle. It's interesting to me that after decades of tracks that mostly stuck to one time of day, this drastic change in World is so insignificant compared to the other overhauls that I've barely seen anyone talk about it. So that's exactly what I want to do today. I'm going to explain how Mario Kart World's changing time of day is implemented, compare it to the static time of day in previous Mario Kart games, and discuss whether I think this is actually a good addition to the series. The nice thing about the game's day-night cycle is that, as opposed to most of the other Mario Kart World stuff I've made videos about, this is something the developers have actually talked about at length in Nintendo's own Ask the Developer interview. For example, they mentioned that a day in-game passes in around 24 minutes, and testing it out myself, that is actually precisely the case, meaning an in-game hour passes every minute, which is a very standard time frame used by many video games, I believe. But what is mostly focused on in this part of the interview is the strangeness of how the time of day progresses in Mario Kart World. Because as opposed to in most other games, and of course real life, World's time of day doesn't shift gradually, but instead snaps between 4 different pre-programmed lighting scenarios every few minutes. Including the 5-second transition periods in between, every day in Mario Kart World is made up of exactly 14 minutes of daytime, 2 minutes of sunset, 6 minutes of nighttime, and 2 minutes of sunrise. The reasoning behind this unorthodox system is that the developers wanted to prevent the players from experiencing the game's tracks at supposedly bland times of day like the period between evening and nighttime, and instead maximize the gameplay potential of a day-night cycle by only focusing on the most appealing settings. This also gave the developers the freedom to manually interfere with the time progression under certain circumstances. Because although the consistent 24-minute cycle applies across free roam and versus mode, both offline and online, Grand Prix and knockout rallies are locked to a predetermined time of day and weather state for each track segment. I'll get into my full thoughts on this implementation later on, but for now I'll say, as far as the quick lighting transitions go, I think a pretty decent balance was struck between making them efficient but not too jarring. When I'm racing around a track and focused on the obstacles and other drivers, I often don't notice the 5-second shift in time of day at all, which can be considered a good thing, but it does highlight an aspect of Mario Kart World's time of day system that the developers didn't discuss because it's basically a massive compromise. See, Mario Kart World makes use of baked lighting. What this means is that instead of rendering things like most shadows or the light that is emitted by environmental assets in-game, these aspects were instead pre-rendered in a program like Blender, or in Nintendo's case likely Maya, using sophisticated techniques like ray tracing. And then the light and shadows produced by these renders were stored in Bakemap textures, which are displayed over top of the environments in-game, making it seem like these effects were produced in real time. The game does use proper real-time shadows for most dynamic assets like the drivers, and the difference between the two types is pretty noticeable since baked shadows are always lower resolution and blurry. So what does all of this have to do with the day-night cycle? Well, obviously most shadows are supposed to be cast as a result of the position of the sun or moon. But because the game's environmental shadows are stored in static texture files, having them move along with the time of day is impossible unless the game blended between numerous sets of bakemaps, which would be incredibly inefficient. I wouldn't be surprised if this partially influenced the decision to implement the sudden time of day shifts as opposed to a more subtle transition. But even with the current 4 lighting scenarios, the direction of the game's shadow still doesn't really make sense. During daytime and nighttime, the sun and moon appear in roughly the same position, which also sort of lines up with the angle and length of the game's shadows. But during sunset and sunrise, not so much. Here you can see the sun is on the left, and the shadow is also pointing left. Not to mention it should be way longer considering how low down the sun is. And this isn't even a baked shadow, because for the sake of consistency, the direction of the real-time lighting also doesn't shift during dawn or dusk. One way to technically fix this would have been to make 3 sets of bakemaps to blend between, but that would make the lighting transitions way more noticeable and highlight the strangeness of the entire system much more. But on the other hand, not having the direction and especially the length of the shadows change at these times of day makes them feel kind of odd. Like, this is probably different for each person, but some subconscious part of my brain can instinctively tell that there's just something not quite right about the lighting during sunset and sunrise. Our minds are trained to expect longer, darker shadows during these parts of the day, so having the lighting remain unchanged feels ever so slightly cursed to me. What's interesting is that dynamic shadows were seemingly planned or at least considered during development, because looking at this piece of concept art, it displays the exact change in shadow length and angle that's missing in the final game. It could be that this art was developed by someone who wasn't aware of the limitations the developers were facing in this regard, but since changing light angles was also mentioned as a factor in the interview, I think it's possible that this was at one point planned to be implemented. After all, several other exploration-based Nintendo games do entirely rely on shifting real-time shadows. Okay, that's enough about shadows, but like I alluded to earlier, bakemaps can also be used to store the light that's projected onto the track. And I actually believe these light maps do exactly what I suggested the shadow maps could do, which is that there's a different set for each time of day. So, for example, you've probably noticed the lighting on Koopa Troopa Beach that's only visible at night. This is the result of a bakemap that seems to get turned off during the day, meaning the track actually appears brighter at night. This makes sense, because in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and presumably World as well, light maps aren't just used to store the lighting that's cast by things like lamps, but also the environmental bounce lighting, which is the result of the time of day. So the light maps of each variation of Mario Kart 8's Animal Crossing track look quite different because they are made to fit with the daytime, sunset or nighttime lighting of each version. And Mario Kart World likely blends between similar light map variations for all of its environments depending on the time of day. The same also goes for lamps, by the way, which instead of realistically getting turned on or off in an instant, also just slowly fade in or out alongside the nighttime lighting. Alright, so far I've mainly just been nitpicking, so let's bring some positivity into this video by talking about the game's skyboxes. Because in my opinion, this is one of the most visually stunning aspects of Mario Kart World, especially in comparison to Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which featured skyboxes that looked good when you weren't paying too much attention to them, but often appeared simultaneously too realistic and too low resolution, in my opinion. On the other hand, World skyboxes strike a perfect balance between semi-realistic cloud formations and an overarching art style that's ever so slightly cartoony. The exaggerated colors and somewhat painterly layers of clouds, which have a subtle texture to them, work perfectly with Mario Kart World's blend of whimsical models and animations, and occasionally more realistic materials. It's no wonder the game's skyboxes were highlighted very prominently in the game's reveal trailer. What's especially impressive is that, as opposed to each environment across the game's map using its own unique skybox, every cloud formation was instead made to fit with any lighting scenario. So the same white clouds you'll find hanging above the area surrounding Wario Stadium appear a dull grey around Bowser's Castle and a sickly green around Boo Cinema. And that's not to mention the fact that they also change with the time of day. Now, an effect like this could technically be achieved by using the same texture over and over again and applying different material colors to it to change the shade of individual colors. But given the depth of gradients and color shifts that get displayed on the same skybox depending on the time of day, I can't imagine this could have been achieved without just fading between entirely different textures. So the game likely stores a large amount of variations of each skybox skybox that it blends between, and in fact it does the same thing for its different skybox types, since the game actually switches between one of its large variety of cloud formations every couple of minutes, which can actually be surprisingly difficult to notice in real time. Even though it technically doesn't have anything to do with the central topic of this video, I guess I should also talk about the game's dynamic weather system. But honestly, there isn't a lot to discuss here because although the developers talked about it as if it was a big feature, randomly encountering rain is incredibly rare from what I've found. In the hours upon hours of footage I recorded for this video, it only rained twice, and one of those occasions was basically just a bit of drizzle. I do think it's cool how, even when triggered as a result of the shock, the game semi-realistically spawns a layer of rain clouds above the player, which seems to be made of a bunch of particles that also fade away once the rain is over. But apart from that, and making the lighting a bit darker and materials a bit shinier, rain doesn't really have much of an impact on the game's presentation. So in summary, a day in Mario Kart World is made up of 4 times of day that appear in order with quick transitions in between. Although the game's shadows don't realistically shift to match, the lighting does change with each setting. The skyboxes themselves stay consistent between different lighting setups, but do periodically transition to a different set of cloud formations, and can even occasionally produce some rain clouds. Now, the question is, was all of this worth the effort? After all, like I mentioned at the very start of the video, it feels like this feature has kind of gone under the radar, and honestly I also think it actually has a negative impact on some parts of the game. Perhaps the track with my favorite vibe across all Mario Kart games is 8 Deluxe's version of Moo Moo Meadows. The cold early morning alpine farmyard aesthetic with the visible breath on the cows and drivers and the bit of fog rolling across the landscape feels almost nostalgic in a way. And in comparison, not only is the more typical racetrack design of World's version not as appealing to me, but because you're likely to play the track at any given time of day, the very specific atmosphere of 8's interpretation is entirely lost. Even when you do happen to play at sunrise, it's clear the track wasn't specifically designed for this, so it's just not the same. And I could say something similar about Shy Guy Bazaar, which in Mario Kart 7 features a purposeful nighttime aesthetic with lanterns and fireworks and whatnot, but in World is just another track that you can maybe occasionally play at night. The same also goes for Wario Shipyard. The fact that this major visual aspect of each track is usually flexible just makes the atmosphere of most tracks less concrete and memorable in my opinion. So why does the game feature the dynamic time of day system then? The developers mentioned this serving the purpose of making the game feel more alive. Having time visually pass as you drive across the world or race along its courses adds a subtle kind of realism to Mario Kart World. And I guess if the system hadn't been implemented and say Shy Guy Bazaar would have stuck to its nighttime visuals, then would the world and skybox just suddenly switch to night when approaching the track in free roam? I don't really see how that would work. It feels to me like, although implementing the day-night cycle caused a fair amount of headaches for the developers, keeping things as they were would have only made free roam more difficult to implement overall. And honestly, it does feel weird complaining about a system that, by definition, adds more content to the game. In a way, this just makes the tracks more replayable. And there are definitely bigger fish to fry when it comes to problems with Mario Kart World that need to be addressed. So anyways guys, that's gonna do it for this video. If you enjoyed, please consider leaving a like or a comment or subscribing or whatever. I also have a Discord server linked in the description, and if you want to watch my videos early, you can sign up for a YouTube channel membership. Thanks for watching, and bye bye!